The day had started like any other travel day for him. He was a man who had spent years working quietly, serving his country, and carrying the weight of responsibility that most people would never imagine. Traveling was nothing new to him. Airports, check-in counters, boarding gates, and the routine of finding his seat on a plane were all parts of his normal life. He had grown used to long flights, tired faces, and the quiet hours spent between destinations. On this particular day, he was flying home after an intense assignment that had kept him away from his family longer than he wanted. All he really wished for was a peaceful flight, some quiet time, and perhaps a nap before landing. He walked through the boarding gate with calm confidence. He wasn't in uniform, and nothing about him shouted who he was or what he did. To the world around him, he was just another traveler carrying a briefcase. He greeted the flight attendants with a polite nod and a quiet thank you as he stepped inside the aircraft. The smell of recycled air mixed with the faint scent of coffee hung in the cabin. Passengers were still finding their seats, placing bags in the overhead compartments, and settling down for the journey. He found his seat in first class. It was not a luxury for him, it was part of the job. His position required him to fly frequently, and the upgrades were part of the arrangements. He sat down, placed his briefcase under the seat in front of him, and leaned back with a sense of relief. For the first time in days, he could breathe without thinking about the pressures of his work. He adjusted his seatbelt and glanced out the small window, watching ground staff move quickly across the tarmac, guiding luggage carts and preparing the plane for departure. Around him, other passengers were busy with their own routines. A young woman flipped through a magazine. A businessman typed rapidly on his laptop. A couple spoke softly, laughing about something only they understood. For a moment, everything seemed normal. But normal never stays for long when prejudice is sitting just a few rows away. The plane had reached its cruising altitude, and the steady hum of the engines filled the cabin. Flight attendants began moving down the aisles, checking seatbelts, offering water, and preparing for meal service. To most passengers, this was the part of the journey when they could finally relax, maybe watch a movie or rest their eyes. But in the front of the plane, all eyes were still drawn to one place. The tension had not gone away. It hung there like an invisible rope pulled tight between two men. The cabin had grown calm again, but it was not the same calmness that existed before the argument began. It was the kind of calm that follows a storm, when the air feels clearer and people sit with a shared memory they know will last long after they land. The black man leaned back in his seat, his badge now tucked away, and returned to the quiet he had wanted from the beginning. For him, the matter was over. But for the passengers around him, the impression remained strong. They had witnessed arrogance collapse under dignity, and it was not something they would forget soon. The man who had caused all the trouble sat stiff in his seat, his shoulders drawn tight, his face pale. He no longer muttered under his breath or pressed the call button to summon attendants. Instead, he stared straight ahead, his eyes fixed on nothing. He looked smaller now, like someone who had been exposed for all the wrong reasons. A few times, he shifted uncomfortably, as though he wanted to say something, perhaps an apology, but his pride held him back. The courage that had fueled his shouting was gone, replaced with silence that felt heavier than words. The other passengers, however, felt lighter. A quiet energy of relief passed through the rows. Conversations resumed, but many of them circled back to what had just happened. A businessman whispered to his colleague, "Can you believe that? He's FBI." His colleague nodded, still amazed. A mother leaned toward her teenage daughter, speaking softly but firmly, "That's why you never judge people by how they look." The young girl nodded, her eyes wide, clearly absorbing the lesson. Even the flight attendants carried themselves differently now. Where they had been tense and careful before, now they moved with ease, their faces brighter. They glanced at the black man with subtle respect, their eyes saying what their voices didn't need to. He, in turn, gave them nothing but quiet kindness. When one of them asked if he needed anything, he simply smiled and said, "I'm fine, thank you." His words were gentle, but they carried strength. As the hours passed, the flight smoothed into routine. The meal service came and went. The clink of trays and the soft murmur of conversations filled the cabin. A movie played on the screens, and some passengers closed their eyes, finally able to rest. But the earlier events lingered in their thoughts, replaying in silence. It was not every day that people witnessed such a reversal, not every day that arrogance was silenced so completely by calm truth. The man who had shouted earlier stayed silent. His posture remained stiff, but his bravado had vanished. He avoided eye contact with everyone around him, especially the man he had accused. Once or twice, he seemed to gather the courage to turn his head, but each time he stopped himself, shrinking back into his seat. He had made himself loud enough for the entire cabin to hear, and now he carried the weight of that choice. The black man, however, remained exactly as he had been, steady, composed, and quietly present. He pulled his book back onto his lap and began reading once again, as though nothing had happened. But those watching him saw more than a man with a book. They saw someone who had carried himself with patience in the face of insult, someone who revealed power only when it was necessary, and someone who reminded them all that strength often wears the face of calm. Hours passed, and the captain's voice eventually filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent shortly. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." Passengers stirred, putting away books, closing laptops, and folding trays. But unlike other flights, this one carried an unspoken unity. People were thinking not just about the destination but about the journey they had just shared. The complaining passenger shifted again, his face flushed as he prepared for landing. The weight of his earlier words pressed on him. He had shouted for the world to hear, but now that same world sat around him, silently judging. His earlier pride had turned into quiet humiliation. He looked like a man who wanted to disappear. The black man finished his book, placing it back in his bag. He tightened his seatbelt and gazed out the window at the soft glow of the clouds below. His face carried no bitterness, no smugness. It was simply calm, the way it had been from the very beginning. He did not need to prove anything more. As the plane descended, something unexpected happened. A woman across the aisle leaned slightly toward him. Her voice was quiet, respectful, almost hesitant. "Sir," she said, "I just want to say, thank you. Thank you for how you handled everything. It meant a lot." The man looked at her, his expression kind. He nodded once, simply replying, "You're welcome." Her words seemed to open the door for others. A businessman behind her leaned forward. "You kept your cool in a way most people couldn't. That was impressive." The black man smiled softly, though he didn't seek praise. "Sometimes the best way to answer is silence," he said quietly. "But sometimes you need to show the truth." The words carried weight, and the passengers around him nodded. They knew he was right. The plane touched down smoothly, the tires pressing against the runway with a gentle thud. Applause broke out softly in the cabin, a habit some passengers carried for good landings, but this time it felt different. It wasn't just about the landing, it was about the whole journey, about the way justice had landed inside that cabin hours earlier. As the plane taxied to the gate, the complaining passenger shrank even further into his seat. He was the first to unbuckle, desperate to get off, but the attendants held him back for a moment. They explained quietly that his behavior would be reported. His face burned red, and he nodded quickly, unwilling to argue any more. The black man stood when it was his turn, lifting his bag with calm strength. He didn't rush. He didn't look for recognition. He simply moved forward with quiet dignity, the same way he had entered the plane hours ago. But now, as he walked down the aisle, passengers glanced at him differently. Some gave small nods. Others smiled. A few whispered thank you. None of it was loud or dramatic, but it carried deep meaning. The man who had once been the target of suspicion now walked off the plane as the one who had earned respect. And the man who had once shouted for attention walked off in silence, carrying the heavy memory of his mistake. Outside the cabin, the world moved on as it always did, people rushing for connections, airport announcements echoing overhead, baggage carts rolling across the floor. But for those who had been in that cabin, something lingered. They had seen a story unfold, one they would tell others later, one that carried a lesson far greater than the flight itself. The black man stepped into the terminal, breathing deeply. The air felt different here, lighter, freer. He walked with steady steps, knowing his journey was not just about reaching his destination. It was about standing tall in moments when others tried to push him down, about holding on to dignity when the world tried to test it. And though he asked for no applause, he carried with him something far greater, the quiet respect of those who had seen him for who he truly was. The memory of the badge, the silence that followed, and the frozen look on the other man's face would stay with every passenger long after the flight was over. It was not just a story about a plane ride. It was a story about character, about patience, about strength that doesn't need to shout. And as the agent disappeared into the crowd, his figure blending into the sea of travelers, one truth remained clear to everyone who had been there: real power is not in the noise of arrogance, but in the calm dignity of truth. The complaining passenger had not quieted down. Even after repeated warnings, he leaned back in his seat with a smug expression, convinced he had exposed something wrong. Every so often, he looked around, searching for someone to agree with him. Some people avoided his eyes. Others gave him subtle looks of disapproval, but he either didn't notice or chose to ignore them. The black man sat silently, calm and unbothered. His stillness confused the other passenger. He had expected anger, defensiveness, or at least some kind of heated reply. Instead, he faced a wall of patience that seemed impossible to crack. What he didn't realize was that the quiet man had faced far greater tests than this, tests that required courage in situations far more dangerous than the inside of an airplane. Finally, the loud passenger decided silence wasn't enough for him. He pressed the call button yet again, demanding the attention of a flight attendant. She came quickly, her face tight with frustration. "Sir," she said firmly, "you've already been warned. If you continue to disturb other passengers, we will have no choice but to report this as disruptive behavior." "Disruptive?" the man scoffed. "I'm the one trying to keep everyone safe here. You don't know who he is. He could be anyone. Why doesn't he explain himself? Why doesn't he prove he belongs here?" He jabbed a finger toward the man beside him, raising his voice enough that the entire cabin could hear. Passengers groaned softly. A few shook their heads, clearly annoyed. A businessman muttered under his breath, "This is embarrassing." A young woman leaned toward her neighbor and whispered, "Why won't he stop?" The black man finally exhaled, setting his book carefully on the tray table in front of him. His movements were slow, deliberate, and calm, but they drew the attention of everyone nearby. He straightened in his seat, resting his hands gently on his lap for a moment. Then, with quiet authority, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. The complaining passenger leaned back slightly, his eyes narrowing. For a moment, he seemed unsure, but his pride forced him forward. "See? See what I mean? He's reaching for something." His voice cracked with both excitement and fear, hoping this was the proof he needed. But what came out of that pocket was not what he expected. The black man pulled out a small leather wallet, smooth and worn from years of use. He opened it slowly, his fingers steady, and turned it toward the loud passenger and the flight attendant standing nearby. Inside gleamed a golden badge and an official identification card. The cabin went silent. The loud passenger's words froze in his throat. His face lost color as his eyes locked on the letters shining from the badge, FBI. The silence stretched for a moment. Then the black man finally spoke, his voice calm but carrying the weight of authority that silenced every whisper in the room. "You've been questioning me this entire flight," he said evenly. You've accused me of things without reason. And you've disturbed every person here. I stayed silent out of respect for the crew and the other passengers. But since you insist on knowing who I am, he tapped the badge lightly with one finger. I'm a federal agent. I serve this country. And I protect the very freedoms that allow you to sit here today. The words were not shouted. They didn't need to be. They were spoken with such quiet certainty that they struck harder than any angry retort could have. Gasps filled the cabin. Some passengers covered their mouths in surprise. Others exchanged wide-eyed looks. The businessman who had been shaking his head earlier let out a short laugh of relief. A woman across the aisle clapped her hands once softly, as if she couldn't contain her approval. The complaining passenger's mouth opened, but no words came out. His confidence had evaporated, replaced with shock. His eyes darted to the flight attendants, as if searching for rescue, but they too were stunned. Slowly, his hand dropped from where he had been pointing, and he sank back into his seat. The black man didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice or mock the man who had spent so long trying to humiliate him. Instead, he simply closed the badge holder and placed it back into his pocket. He leaned back in his seat, his expression calm once more, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But to the passengers around him, everything had changed. The flight attendant who had been standing there straightened, her face breaking into the smallest of smiles. "Thank you, sir," she said quietly, with genuine respect in her voice. Then she turned to the disruptive passenger, her tone now sharper than before. "Sir, you've caused a serious disturbance. You've insulted another traveler without reason. And now it's clear you've been wrong from the beginning. I strongly suggest you remain quiet for the rest of this flight." The man swallowed hard, nodding quickly, though he avoided everyone's eyes. His earlier arrogance had drained away completely. He looked smaller somehow, his shoulders hunched, his voice gone. Around the cabin, a ripple of energy moved through the passengers. Relief, respect, and even pride filled the air. Some people smiled openly at the black man. A few nodded in appreciation. One man raised his glass of water slightly, as if offering a silent toast. The message was clear: dignity had won. The black man, however, asked for nothing in return. He didn't need applause or validation. His work had taught him that true authority required humility. He turned his gaze back toward the window, watching the endless stretch of clouds outside. For him, this was just another moment where patience had triumphed over noise. Yet for the man beside him, the one who had spent so long shouting, this was a lesson he would never forget. His face burned with embarrassment. He shifted in his seat, unable to find comfort, his earlier boldness turned to silence. Every glance from another passenger reminded him of his mistake. The cabin, once heavy with tension, now felt lighter. The quiet had returned, but it wasn't the same as before. It was filled with respect, with a sense of justice that had played out before their very eyes. The engines roared softly as the plane cut smoothly through the sky. Meal service began, and flight attendants rolled carts down the aisles once more. Laughter returned in small bursts, conversations resumed, and people settled back into their journeys. But beneath it all, the memory of that moment lingered, the badge shining, the calm words, the stunned silence. The black man lifted his glass of water and took a slow sip. For him, it was not about winning an argument. It was about standing tall without raising his voice, about proving that respect doesn't need to shout. And though he didn't seek it, he had earned the admiration of nearly everyone on that plane. A man entered the cabin, tall, heavy-set, and with a sharp, impatient expression on his face. He looked around with a kind of entitlement, as if every seat and every person needed his approval. When his eyes fell on the black man sitting calmly in his seat, his lips curled ever so slightly, and a look of disapproval flashed across his face. He didn't say anything at first. He placed his bag in the overhead bin, sat down nearby, and kept glancing sideways as though something about the man's presence bothered him. The cabin seemed to grow heavier with every passing minute. The engines outside gave a steady hum, but inside, tension floated in the air like an invisible cloud. The flight attendant had walked away, hoping the matter would settle on its own, yet the passenger who had been complaining could not stop himself. His eyes kept darting toward the black man as if searching for something wrong, something to justify his suspicion. Every little move the way the plane rolled slowly away from the gate, the cabin lights dimming slightly as the crew prepared for takeoff. But while the world outside moved smoothly, the world inside was anything but calm. The man who had been complaining grew restless, shifting in his seat and glancing around as though hoping to find support. He wanted others to nod, to agree with him, to validate the suspicion that only existed in his own mind. Yet the cabin remained quiet, filled with people who had seen enough to know who the real disturbance was. The black man sat with his book closed, his hands resting gently on top of it. He was no longer reading. His eyes were steady, watching the behavior of the man beside him with quiet awareness. He wasn't angry. Instead, he carried himself with the kind of patience that only comes from years of discipline. But inside, he was also calculating. He understood how quickly situations like this could spiral out of control, especially in a setting as sensitive as an airplane. The passenger suddenly pressed the call button again. This time, his voice was louder, his words sharper. "I want someone to come here right now," he demanded. "I don't care how long it takes. I want him checked. I don't feel safe with him sitting here, and I won't stay quiet about it." The flight attendant hurried over, trying to keep her composure. She knelt slightly beside the man's seat and spoke in a firm, low voice. "Sir, I need you to calm down. We cannot keep delaying procedures because of this. You're disturbing the entire cabin." "I have the right to feel safe," the man snapped. His voice echoed through the rows, drawing more attention. "You don't know who he is. For all you know, he could be dangerous. Look at him. He's too quiet. Why doesn't he say anything? Doesn't that bother you?" Passengers were watching openly now. A young man across the aisle frowned and shook his head. A woman leaned closer to her friend and whispered, "This is getting out of hand." A teenager pulled out her phone as if she considered recording the scene, but her mother gently lowered it, not wanting to escalate things further. The black man slowly shifted forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He was still silent, but his calmness spoke louder than the other man's shouting. He knew this was not the time to reveal who he really was. The moment wasn't right yet. Instead, he allowed the scene to continue, measuring every detail, every word, every reaction. His silence was not weakness, it was strategy. The complaining passenger grew bolder, standing halfway in the aisle now. He pointed directly at the man beside him, his finger sharp like an accusation. "I demand to see his boarding pass." "Show us your ticket," he shouted. "If you have nothing to hide, prove it. Let everyone see it." Gasps spread through the cabin. It was no longer a private complaint whispered to a flight attendant, it was a public humiliation attempt. The target was clear, the accusation loud. Some passengers looked horrified, others looked tired of the nonsense. The flight attendant quickly placed a hand on the man's shoulder, urging him to sit down. "Sir, you need to return to your seat immediately," she warned. "This behavior is unacceptable. If you don't stop, we will have no choice but to involve authorities when we land." But the man scoffed. "Authorities? Good. Let them come. Let them see I was right all along." His voice carried the smugness of someone who believed he was untouchable, someone who thought his complaints would be taken more seriously than the dignity of the man beside him. The black man finally lifted his head, looking directly at the passenger who pointed at him. His eyes were calm, but they held a depth that made the other man falter for a brief second. He didn't speak. He didn't argue. He simply held that gaze, and for a moment, the noisy passenger lost the strength of his voice. Yet pride quickly pushed him forward again. "Why don't you say something?" the man sneered. "If you really belong here, if you're really supposed to be sitting next to me, prove it. Or are you just going to stay silent, hoping no one notices?" The silence that followed was heavier than any word could have been. The black man sat back again, crossing his arms lightly, showing that he would not bend to the provocation. Around the cabin, murmurs began. Some passengers whispered, "This is wrong." Others shook their heads in disbelief. A small ripple of support began to build, not with shouts or interruptions, but with the quiet presence of people who knew what fairness looked like. The flight attendants exchanged uneasy glances. They had been trained for disruptive passengers, but rarely did those disruptions target another traveler so directly. One of them leaned toward the black man, her face apologetic. "Sir," she said softly, "I'm so sorry you're experiencing this. Please bear with us while we manage the situation." He gave her a simple nod, his expression steady. "I understand," he replied calmly. His voice was quiet, but those who heard it noticed its strength. It wasn't the voice of someone intimidated, it was the voice of someone in control. The complaining man smirked, mistaking that calm reply for surrender. "See," he said loudly, turning to the passengers around him as if gathering a jury. "He has nothing to show, nothing to say. He doesn't belong here. And you all know it." But what the man didn't know, what no one around him yet knew, was that the quiet passenger had more authority than anyone else in that cabin. He wasn't just another traveler. He wasn't just a man heading home after a long assignment. He was someone who had sworn an oath, someone who had spent years protecting the very freedoms that allowed men like this to speak so loudly without fear. For now, he remained silent, allowing the scene to unfold. But every second, the complaining passenger was digging his own hole deeper, exposing his arrogance for all to see. And though the black man sat still, his presence was growing larger with every passing moment. The engines roared louder as the plane gathered speed on the runway. The cabin rattled slightly as it prepared to lift into the sky. Passengers braced themselves against the force of takeoff, but their eyes still flicked toward the drama in the front. Even as the wheels left the ground and the world outside tilted upward, the real weight inside the cabin was not the climb into the clouds but the confrontation that was still far from reaching its peak. The man who had shouted felt sure of himself, confident that his voice carried power. But soon, very soon, he would learn that true power did not come from loud accusations or false pride. It came from truth, from dignity, and from authority that needed no explanation until the right moment. And when that moment arrived, the entire cabin would remember it. He adjusted his seatbelt, the way he placed his hand on the armrest, even the way he quietly turned the page of his book seemed to irritate the man beside him. The black man, however, remained calm. Years of discipline had taught him that silence was sometimes stronger than words. He had dealt with louder voices than this, in places where staying calm had meant survival. But here, in this cabin filled with strangers, his patience was being tested in a very different way. He felt the stares of others. Some passengers looked at him with sympathy, while others avoided eye contact altogether. It wasn't new to him, but it still carried weight. The complaining passenger leaned over once again, catching the attention of another flight attendant who was passing by. This time, his voice was more urgent, more dramatic, as though he had rehearsed his lines. "Excuse me, miss," he said firmly, pointing with his thumb toward the black man. "I really think you need to double-check his ticket. I don't believe he belongs here." The attendant, a young man this time, frowned politely. "Sir, everyone here is seated correctly. If there was a mistake, it would have been fixed at the gate." The passenger shook his head, refusing to accept the explanation. "You don't understand. I don't feel comfortable. Look at him. Does he look like he belongs here? Are you telling me you don't see the problem?" The words grew sharper. More passengers turned their heads now, pulled into the conflict whether they liked it or not. A mother with 2 children hushed them quickly, trying to distract them with a toy. An elderly man tilted his head in disapproval at the commotion. People were beginning to whisper, their curiosity stirred. The black man lifted his eyes from his book, meeting the gaze of the attendant for just a moment. There was no anger in his face, only calm dignity. He did not defend himself with words, he didn't need to. His silence carried its own message, he knew who he was, and no insult could erase that. Still, the other man's persistence pressed harder. He raised his voice a little louder this time, his tone carrying across the cabin. I'm saying this because I care about safety. What if he's hiding something? What if he's a threat? I want him checked. Right now. Gasps rippled softly through the nearby rows. The accusation was no longer about a ticket or a seat, it was about his very presence. A businessman leaned toward his colleague, whispering in disbelief. He's just sitting there, minding his business, the man muttered. This is ridiculous. The flight attendant, struggling to maintain professionalism, assured the complaining passenger again. Sir, there is no reason to question another traveler's right to be here. Please, I need you to remain calm. We're about to depart. But calm was not what the passenger wanted. His voice carried a strange confidence, the kind that came from believing others would silently agree with him. He pointed more openly now, almost performing for the cabin. I'm telling you all something isn't right here. Don't say I didn't warn you later. The black man shifted slightly in his seat, closing his book fully and setting it on his lap. He was still quiet, but inside, he measured the situation. His training told him this wasn't just about one rude traveler, it was about control. He knew he could end this in a moment, but he also knew the value of patience. Sometimes people revealed more about themselves if given enough time to speak. And this man, loud as he was revealing far more than he realized. Around them, tension brewed. Some passengers sat uncomfortably, unsure if they should speak. A young woman across the aisle looked directly at the black man, her eyes apologetic, as though silently saying, I'm sorry you have to deal with this. A father with his teenage son whispered, ignore him. He's just making a scene. But ignoring was hard when the noise kept rising. The complaining passenger pressed the call button for the 3rd time. His finger jabbed at it as though he were summoning backup for a personal war. Another attendant came, her face already tired from the back and forth. Sir, she said firmly, we cannot continue this discussion if you raise your voice. Please lower it, or we will have to address this further. The man scoffed. Oh, so I'm the problem now? You're siding with him instead of me. His voice rose another notch, and the cabin grew tense once more. I have every right to feel safe on this flight. And I don't feel safe sitting next to him. This time, the black man finally raised his eyes fully, looking straight into the man's face. His expression was calm, his posture steady. He didn't say a word, but the weight of his gaze alone carried power. It was the look of someone who knew himself, someone who had stood taller battles and survived. For the first time, the complaining man shifted uncomfortably in his seat, though he tried to mask it with more bluster. The attendant held up her hand. Enough, sir. If you continue, we may need to involve security before departure. At the mention of security, murmurs broke out among the passengers. Some nodded in agreement, clearly fed up with the disruption. Others leaned back, anxious about what might happen next. The black man leaned back in his seat as well, folding his hands neatly in front of him. He was still silent, but anyone looking at him could sense that he was not afraid. The engines roared softly as the plane prepared for pushback, but the drama inside seemed louder than the machines outside. The complaining passenger crossed his arms with exaggerated frustration, muttering loudly enough for others to hear. Unbelievable. Nobody listens until something goes wrong. Just wait, you'll see. The man's words spread a chill, though not the kind he intended. Instead of convincing others, his behavior made him appear more unreasonable. More passengers were now siding with the calm figure sitting silently with his book. The contrast between the two men could not have been sharper, one consumed with loud suspicion, the other grounded in quiet strength. As the flight attendants prepared the cabin for takeoff, people settled again, though the unease lingered. The racist passenger's complaints were not finished. His eyes still darted to the black man, still searching for some imagined flaw, still feeding his own false narrative. But little did he know, the silence he mistook for weakness was the very thing that would later leave him speechless. And as the wheels of the plane prepared to lift off the ground, every person in that cabin sensed that this conflict was far from over. At first, the black man ignored it. He had experienced that look before, the subtle stare, the unspoken judgment, the question in someone's eyes of whether he belonged. Years of dealing with it had taught him not to react too quickly. Instead, he pulled out a book from his bag and began reading, focusing on the words and letting the pages carry him away from the stares. But the man beside him couldn't let it go. He shifted in his seat, muttered something under his breath, and pressed the call button for the flight attendant. The young woman in uniform approached with a polite smile, not yet aware of the storm that was about to build. The man leaned toward her, lowering his voice just enough that he thought others wouldn't hear, though his tone carried across the quiet cabin. "I don't feel comfortable with him sitting here," the man said, gesturing with his chin toward the black passenger. The flight attendant blinked, taken aback. She glanced at the man who was quietly reading his book, completely unbothered, then back at the complaining passenger. "Sir, is there a problem?" she asked carefully. "Yes, there's a problem," the man replied with irritation. "People like him don't belong in first class. Are you sure he has the right ticket? I want you to check it." The words were not shouted, but they carried enough bite to turn a few heads. Passengers sitting nearby looked up from their magazines and laptops, sensing that something unusual was happening. The black man remained calm, his eyes fixed on the pages in front of him, though his ears caught every word. The flight attendant, trained to handle conflicts with patience, tried to smooth things over. "Sir, everyone in this section has been ticketed properly," she explained gently. "There's no issue here. Please, make yourself comfortable." But the man wasn't satisfied. He leaned back in his seat, grumbling loud enough for others to hear. "Unbelievable. First class isn't what it used to be," he muttered. "You let just anyone in these days." The atmosphere shifted. Some passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Others pretended not to notice, burying their faces in newspapers or screens. The man's words hung in the air, heavy and sharp, as if daring someone to challenge him. The black man closed his book slowly. He didn't look at the passenger, not yet. Instead, he took a deep breath, reminding himself of the discipline he had lived by for years. This wasn't the first time he had seen such behavior, and sadly, it wouldn't be the last. He had been trained to stay calm in far more dangerous situations than this, and if he could survive those, he could survive a stranger's prejudice on an airplane. Still, he felt the eyes of the cabin on him. Some were sympathetic, others curious, and a few indifferent. The engines of the plane hummed softly as boarding continued. More passengers entered, unaware of the tension forming in first class. The black man straightened in his seat, adjusting his posture. He wouldn't let anyone's words shake his dignity. He knew who he was, and nothing this man said could change that. For now, he chose silence, waiting to see how far the other passenger would push. The complaining man, however, seemed determined to make it an issue. He pressed the call button again, frustration rising in his voice as he spoke once more to the attendant. His tone carried arrogance, as though he expected everyone around him to share his opinion. "I'm telling you, I don't feel safe with him here. I want him moved. I don't want to spend this flight sitting next to that." This time, the words were louder. People across the cabin heard them clearly. A wave of discomfort swept through the seats. A young woman frowned, whispering to the person next to her. The businessman paused his typing, shaking his head with disbelief. Even the couple who had been laughing moments ago grew quiet, watching carefully. The black man didn't react. His silence was powerful in itself. Without saying a word, he made it clear he was not going to be dragged down by insults or assumptions. His calm presence stood in stark contrast to the other man's rising anger. And so, in the quiet tension of that first chapter of the flight, two very different kinds of men sat side by side. One carried arrogance and prejudice like a shield, lashing out at someone he didn't even know. The other carried dignity, patience, and a hidden strength that no one around him could yet see. The plane had not even left the ground, but already the stage was set for a confrontation that would leave the entire cabin stunned.